Welcome to the Divorcing Religion YouTube channel, where you'll find episodes of the Divorcing Religion podcast, the Conference on Religious Trauma, and the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference. Don't miss my interviews with great guests like Seth Andrews, Dr. Daryl Ray, and author Margaret Atwood, talking about religion and religious trauma syndrome. Become a member for more benefits, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss new content. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. Before we get into our excellent show today, I want to let you know that the Conference on Religious Trauma is on hiatus this year as I prepare for the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture event that I'll be hosting in person in Seattle next year in the beautiful Emerald City. For more information, you can go to shamelesssexuality.org. Now, I'm very excited about my guest today because I've wanted to have him on the show for a couple of years. I'm talking with Teddy Hose. Teddy is an artist, writer, and public figure on the topic of cults after growing up in the Unification Church, or Moonies, of the late Sun Myung Moon. Teddy has appeared on Netflix's Explained Cults episode and How to Become a Cult Leader, as well as A&E's Cults and Extreme Belief, which featured the cult's splinter group, Rod of Iron Ministries, who worships with AR-15s. With Teddy's parents being early and respected members of the Unification Church, his family lived close to the Moon family estate in Tarrytown, New York. This was a mix of status in the community, being around Moon family violence, and a constant fear of kids and teachers in school finding out that he was a Moonie. Teddy's family eventually left the cult after moving to Seattle in his teens. Teddy now lives in Brooklyn, where he works in video and motion graphics while making informative social media videos about cults, in addition to his own multimedia art, and his website is teddyhose.com. And Teddy often highlights how the Moons pay far-right political figures like the Trumps to participate in their events, and the cult's founding of the Washington Times, which is also behind OAN, or One America News Network. Teddy, I'm so glad to see you today. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity and the enthusiasm.
Yeah, I am totally enthusiastic because I was so shocked when I watched you on one of the shows. You really introduced me to the Rod of Iron Ministries. Now, I'm in Canada. We're not big gun fans over here. I mean, some people do have them for hunting, but nothing like nearly what goes on in the United States. And so when I heard about a church where there was blessings of these weapons going on, that just blew my mind. If I hadn't seen you on there, I don't know that I even would have believed it. So thank you for coming to talk to us about it. And I wonder if you'd start off telling us a little bit about your childhood.
Okay. That's a loaded question. So I was born into the Unification Church. I was born in Washington, D.C. when my dad was a pastor there. My parents had an arranged marriage in the Unification Church. Although back then it was a smaller group, so they kind of all knew each other. It wasn't as, crazy as it got later to where you marry a total stranger who might not even speak your same language. But and then we moved to New York, near where the Moon family estate was, in Tarrytown, Irvington, New York, which is about a 30-minute drive north of New York City. And we lived on one of the church properties there. And that's where mostly I speak from the time I was about 5 to like 13, when basically we're in ground zero for the Unification Church. We would see the Moon family children around on church properties whenever we were there for an event or a gathering or for church. And sometimes they would give an authoritarian speech, if they just felt like it. And or sometimes they would be violent if someone like challenged them or weren't as familiar with the Moons and maybe nonchalantly thought to correct them or something. they would like
Wow.
take him to a room and like beat him up or something. It's just they're basically a mafia family, and they operate very much like a mafia, quite literally. And Moon's first business was a gun business, and then his son took over. Anyway, I'm kind of veering, but basically, yeah, for myself and my family, it was a mix of like, we were comforted by the church community. We would go out to like diners and movies and whatnot. We got to go to public school. It wasn't one of those really cut off from society cults. It was more like Scientology, where they tried to be like in with pop culture and like get celebrities to endorse them. My dad would like, he said he was on campaigns to try to get Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley to go on tour for the Unification Church. They had a lot of money. They were, allegedly funded by the Korean CIA. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, so we had like we stayed on a pretty nice property in Tarrytown, New York, which is a very affluent, neighborhood in Irvington. It's where, New Yorkers actually make fun of Westchester County, where it's in, because they say like that's where old money goes. And it doesn't have the best reputation with the diversity of people and incomes here in New York City. So it gets teased a lot. So I always have to explain to people, like, I'm from Westchester, but I'm not from Westchester. it's a long story. Like, we were just part of the cult leader was rich, and he gave us places to stay and employment. But, my parents, there was hardly such a thing as a personal income in the Unification Church. We always felt poor. We were eating ramen every weekend, and like, just yeah, that basically that's how cults work. I think most cults, they don't give you much of a personal income. They provide housing, a job, and everything, and then so basically they make your purchases of resources for you. So that way you just stay enmeshed in this whole community that you stay dependent on. So that was the reality of my childhood. And my parents were, another thing about cults is my parents were gone a lot on world missions. So we were raised in like a home daycare situation where like every 2 or 3 years there was like a random church member would come and just take care of us. Yeah. And later I learned that some of these church members were the quote unquote problem members who the church therapist, who was, probably unlicensed, would prescribe to stay with a family in order for them to learn how like a family setting for their healing. So we were used for their healing because
gosh.
let's say they had like anger issues, or like, one guy was gay, and, they don't accept homosexuality. They're very anti-gay in the Unification Church. So, nothing really happened to us. But the anger guy was a little scary, but he never hit us or anything. But anyway, it was just, totally off the grid, totally unregulated. It's weird because cults are very regulated and they're very unregulated. So it's just wild. But yeah, and then going to school, all the kids in the neighborhood, they knew about this cult, and they were just like, it felt like they were just sniffing out who was in this cult. And so that was very scary because it was also in the news at the time. This was the 80s. That, like even SNL had a sketch about cults called Night of the Moonies, where it looks like Night of the Living Dead, where the Moonies are all these zombies. And, so this is like, as a kid, I was like, this is how they view me. I have to keep this quiet. And like, just, I just hung out with the other dorks who were like invisible to the rest of the school. Yeah, just keeping a low profile. So,
Wow.
And yeah, so well, there's the loaded question. Unloading of the loaded question. Yeah.
Did you ever wonder about, if it was a cult, or have any feelings like, this seems weird? I mean, because when you're raised in it, you don't really have any other anything to measure it by. It's just all that you know.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, absolutely. It just like, no, I never thought, oh, is this a cult? Because like, it was all I knew. And it's like, my brain didn't even dare go there, because I was like, I rely on this for everything. And the fact that the cult takes your parents away means that you don't have a lot of individual like dignity. Like as I told my therapist the other day, I was like, the key word is dignity. Like you don't, your dignity doesn't get bred. Like you have to find that in your own, like Lord of the Flies, you know? So like, um, I was so enmeshed with it, and I was like, this is my default community. Like it's almost like an immigrant. I was like, this is my country, my culture. You know, Sun Myung Moon is my president. Like he always felt like a politician to me more than like a messiah figure. Well, yeah. I mean, I think in the back of my mind, I was thinking that, but on the surface, I was like, "Oh yeah, he's Jesus' second coming, sure." But anyway, um,
Wow.
yeah,
So how
that's what
did
he
the
claimed to be.
deconversion go then, or the deconstruction? Your folks moved you guys to Seattle, and so then
Right.
they weren't involved in the church in Seattle.
So my parents were they were working in the pretty high offices. They were in like managing positions in Unification Church in New York, and um, sadly, my mom got into like an accident that almost killed her, and
Mm.
so I think it was then that my parents realized like like what are we doing with our lives? Like we know this is corrupt because they saw things that were going on in that office that were just completely unhinged. I mean, this cult leader guy, just like all the other cult leaders, believed he had sexual powers and he was practicing them, and he was
Mhm.
married but not really because he thought he was the second coming of Jesus and he could do whatever the hell he wanted. So
Wow.
like yeah, and he just put a spiritual spin on it. It's a lot like Trump basically. But
Mhm.
yeah, so basically um they kind of had their doubts, and then there was this motion that the cult leader made where he said all parents should move to your father's hometown in order to spread the witnessing effort. Uh, and actually, it wasn't until recently, that was like in the late 80s, early 90s, but it wasn't until recently that I learned that it was actually for him to cover up a lawsuit where, like, if you split up his congregation to other places, he's done this more than once, then, like,
Wow.
they won't be able to prosecute him as easily. So, yeah, we moved to Seattle, and I think, and it's funny because I heard this from a lot of church families who made this move to wherever their father's hometown was. A lot of them saw it as like, oh, we're away from headquarters and we don't have to look over our shoulder anymore. So they kind of just gradually drifted away. They stopped paying for the like church taxes, or basically whenever they ask for money for a campaign, this or that. That's how the Moon sustain themselves. It's just trafficking in one form or another. So yeah, from there we just kind of slowly drifted. Like again, it was the only childhood I knew. It was the only community I felt like I was allowed to feel like intimate and like friendly and like like family with, and that everyone outside was just, that was never an option as a child. So like I think for me more than some of my other church friends, because I actually lived near the Moons where the pressure was a lot stronger. So yeah, I just kind of in my head through my teens, as we were slowly like one by one stopped doing the rituals, stopped going to church, and had just kind of a casual thing on Sundays with some of the other like less involved members. I was like, I have to make myself now, like I have to like actually trust the people I go to school with now. I have to like take those risks. Like it was just in my kid brain, it was
Wow.
just like, I have to survive this. And like this thing I knew my whole childhood is not an option anymore. And yeah, so just step by step. And I don't think it's ever going to be something I'm like autonomously comfortable with, like just as much as the average person. But I just try to be patient with myself and be like, it just takes me a little longer to trust to get to know people. Yeah.
Oh, good for you. That's exactly the right attitude. I love that you're practicing compassion for yourself. I wonder if did any of your family members stay with the church?
No, I think I think parts of us stayed a bit because of those, like those things we were nurtured with as kids, just the community and everything. My youngest brother, like he doesn't see as much of a split between the church and the real world. Like he was 9 when we moved to Seattle, and I was 13. So I think I think in your adolescence is when the church really starts packing on the, I guess that's when your hormones kick in. So they're like, we got to tighten the control. So he didn't quite hit that yet. So I think he's a little smoother about it, and he sees it as like, oh, I see that he has like nuances of like, oh, I wish all of our families lived in a cul-de-sac together. Like he still wants that communal thing, and he sees no problem with it. But I'm like, red flag. I don't know. But I mean, things are working out for him. Like that was his support structure, and he accepts it. And me, I'm always criticizing it, like, oh no, but this is wrong. And that. So like, I always leave room for question, or if I'm doing something wrong, So, and I think I do sometimes maybe want to try to control things or change things too much in my head. But really, that could also be the pandemic trauma of like, there's always critical voices in my head if I'm alone too long. So I need to get out more and just like neutralize a bit. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I wonder, did you run into the problem that actually a lot of us who come from high demand backgrounds run into is where we end up going from one group to another. So I work sometimes with people who grew up in I'll just say Mormon, maybe a very strict devout Mormon home. Maybe they leave Mormonism, but then they jump into a multi-level marketing or a yoga cult or something else. I'm familiar that happens with a lot of people. Were you able to avoid that trap?
Nope, I fell into it. My sister actually, she was going to the University of Washington, and her and I, we were like the middle children, and about this whole thing about the middle children trying to fix everything for being a negotiator. So like, it was actually optional to do this like 1 to 2 year program after high school. This is still with the Unification Church. It was called STF at the time, Special Task Force. And it's basically just like a frontline program where you live near a college campus. You try to witness to college students. It's kind of like the Mormons, do that thing when they're like young adults. And you also basically get labor trafficked, like you sell trinkets door to door for months at a time. That's mostly what the program is about. They're just, that's what it thrives on, is human trafficking, as I call it. Some people are like, that doesn't sound like human trafficking. And I'm like, buddy, you don't know the nuances, like, and you have to study a lot about this stuff in order to like reach that point, and like, or not. Maybe some people get it earlier. Anyway, so we both did that. And I think that kind of radicalized us a bit. And then when we both went to college, she ran into some people like who were, have you ever heard of the Southwestern program? Southwestern Company? The Southwestern Company, I think it's called like the Southwestern family of companies now or something, because they're probably expanding, but they sell educational books door to door, and it's a very high demand program, and like they target college students on college campuses, and you basically only make commission. You work like 80 hours a week. They encourage you to run from door to door, and you're trying to sell these books and stuff. And like, I wasn't like, at first I was like, wow, this is pretty intense, but in my head, I was like, at least we get to keep the money this time,
Right.
And that's how they get you. They're like, oh, you can make thousands of dollars. And some people do well, but like, I would say 90% of the people leave just exhausted and traumatized. And well, I don't know. I can't paint it one color. I did become more ambitious. It did get me out of myself, and I learned how to sell. I can interview well now. I guess I learned some survival skills, but I think it did like do some damage still. But and just knowing how much capitalism likes to take advantage of the vulnerable. Like, I was like, yep, that was me in the right place in the right time. So basically I what was I gonna say? That was pretty intense, and I almost did a second year, right at the end of the first summer. Everyone's like, yeah, great job. And actually, what I was going to say was, it wasn't until I learned that it started like decades earlier as a company selling Bibles. I was like, oh, it is a cult. They just had to like survive with the progressive times, and now they sell educational books. But now I'm like, what was in those books? What kind of education in this Bible-based company? And the whole like feeling of like, say you go to 1 week of sales school and it's like pump up, like we're going to do this. And they tell all these stories, and they had like Rudy from the movie Rudy, like come and speak about like determination and making your goals. But yeah, what was I going to say? I forgot what I was going to wrap that up with, but yeah, the Bible thing, I was just kind of like, oh boy, this is like kind of almost like a pyramid scheme. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me as you're describing it, and the whole thing of you can make so much money. And I remember when I would get sucked into some of those, it was like you can make so much money. All your time will be free to do missions work. You won't have to work. Like it just all those things were. It's a fantasy that they're selling people to get them involved for sure. Well, thank you for sharing that was your experience. You're definitely in good company, not alone there at all. And so eventually you got to a point where you did recognize the Moon family or the Unification Church or whatever, the whole thing wasn't all it was cracked up to be, that there were some significant issues. Your parents, when they were working high up in the organization, they were aware of some behavior that was not, it was unbecoming behavior, shouldn't have been going on. But you weren't privy to that behavior because you weren't an adult working in those things. So you kind of had to work your own way out. And looking backwards, hindsight is always so much clearer. When we're in the midst of something, it's very hard to see what's going on. How did you come to be educating people about the Unification Church and about Rod of Iron Ministries? Did you know Sean, the fellow now who is the head of that, seems to be the head of Rod of Iron Ministries? Did you know him when you were growing up?
Yep. So when I saw him in his like tactical gear and with his guns, I was like, of course he would do that. Yeah, he's such a douche.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah,
So there were signs even when you were younger. You're like, oh yeah, no thanks.
Yeah, the Moon family is interesting. It's mostly brothers. I think there's only like 2 or 3 sisters in that family. There's like 13 kids in that family. There's other kids and who knows how many kids there are in other, with other wives of his. But anyway, there was a spectrum, like well, actually it's more like a binary. There were some kids who were like nice, and like 2 or 3 of the kids were actually like kind of sensitive, and and the other ones were just really violent. And like, if you look at some pictures of the Moon family, they just have this look on their face of like, don't mess with me, this scowl. And Sean Moon was one of those kids who had more of the scowl than he did like, just kind of something calm or more sensitive. I mean, if you can believe it or not, in a toxic family like that, like there were like 2 or 3 who were actually approachable. But I don't think it's wise to be friends with any of them, because I think they all have like sociopathic tendencies, and they basically treated members like toys or minions. So it's just, there's no friends with them. But yeah, he bullied the kids in this one church property called Jacob House in Tarrytown. And I mean, I remember one of the kids there described it to me. He's like, he would lock them in closets until they cried, or make them fight each other for his own entertainment, which is actually what Trump did to new cadets when he was in military school. And so when I heard that in a podcast, I was like, oh my God, like this is a power thing. And he would like, he would fart in a room and tell everyone to smell it up. Like he would basically he would humiliate, like their humiliation was his power. And then it's interesting because like thinking about that, I was like, that's probably what Sun Myung Moon is like, because like he probably loves and is laughing at or he loves to humiliate his members, because in my year of STF, we sold wind chimes door to door. We had to carry them on shower rings, which was absolutely humiliating. And I'm like, I bet Sun Myung Moon or whoever else is just like laughing at this, like, I don't know. I think he's a sick bully. Their family is just full of them. But at the same time, I think Sean Moon is just very depraved guy. I had heard also from this same kid who grew up in Jacob House that one time someone fought back Sean Moon, or like his Korean name is Hyungjin Moon, so that's why I know him Hyungjin. But so I might say that sometimes. But he just like talked back to him or something, and Sean Moon like ordered other kids to beat him up or something. I think they did, but then he was like crying, like in the corner or something. So I think they're really helpless. And there is a podcast episode where an older second generation, born into the cult, talks about how he went on a road trip with one of the Moon kids, because like when they were all younger, they didn't realize the extent of like how scary it is to be around those people and how risky it is. So he didn't assume anything, and he just did the way he described situations, like when we all pitched in to get a pizza together, like a box pizza, like he's like, oh, I'll just get it. And he said the Moon guy was like, what? He's like, no, we have to all split this. And he's like, no, I'll get it. He didn't understand courtesy at all, which is really sad, So I think it's just a very depraved family in a way, and then they compensate for it by just overpowering people and making people do things for them, because full grown adults have been bowing to them since they were babies. So it's so twisted. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And what also was really shocking to me is how far their reach has been to countries all around the world, and political involvement there that regular people just aren't really aware of or don't know anything about. And I remember reading, I think maybe in a Rolling Stone article, about there was a coronation that took place. I don't know if it was the original Reverend Moon, or but it was in Washington, D.C. on some kind of political property, and he had some kind of coronation there, and there were like a dozen politicians who watched it. And it's crazy, because currently with the Rod of Iron Ministries, they seem to be very much against the United States and rooting and working towards its downfall.
By that, do you mean like they say it a lot, because they seem like they have a lot of patriotism, and even some of Sun Myung Moon's quote are very white supremacist. Like, wow, there's a quote where he's like, I'm trying to save white people and white assets, something to that effect. It's in like 2 of my TikTok videos. But wow. Yeah, he straight up says that. And he has a national newspaper called the Washington Times, which has white nationalists, white supremacist writers who, it's not going to be overt, but they have those nuances enough to like be able to write for this paper and just sneak it in, because that's how a lot of them get away with it.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's I don't know. A lot of intelligence reports from the 70s, and there's like New York Times articles that talk about how the Korean CIA basically made the Unification Church and uses it as a political tool. And when Sun Myung Moon was about to be brought to court for that by Donald Frazier, who was, I believe, what was he, a congressman in Minnesota, I believe, or I forgot what his title was, but Moon changed his name and fled to another country as soon as he was like going to get indicted or whatever. Yeah. Or called the court. I forgot what the term was, but yeah. So, it's just things like that are just really confirm that he's a con man. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And it feels like cult leaders, and I mean, malignant narcissists, people who rise up the ranks, unfortunately, to become, they take over countries just like Trump is trying to do. They share so much in common. And even when we were first talking and you mentioned about Reverend Moon or cult leader Moon, getting weird about sex, deciding that he could have sex, have all these different wives. It always seems to go that way. with cult leaders. I mean, it might start out as something, but sex seems to get in there somehow. And often name changes, like the cult leaders will give people their names, decide who can marry whom, and when they can have kids or if they can have kids. There's just so much control that's involved there. So it sounds like the Unification Church has had dealings with high-profile right-wing political families like the Trumps. And would that be to try and stay in the good graces of the politicians, or to try and raise the status of the Rod of Iron Ministries? What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's also to prove to maybe mostly to prove to their own members that, like, see, we're legitimate and people are listening to us and we matter, like in this conversation about, patriotism and basically, Christofascism, if I were to be honest, or Christian nationalism, So yeah, it's that ilk. And so that's what compels me to speak about it, because I'm like, I know that sphere very well. I know how people think in that space. And I want to speak in my videos and in my activism in a way that can hopefully reach them. Not to be like, oh, you idiots, what the hell are you doing? It's more like, I remember what it was like. I just tell my story for that reason, because I'm like, I know that space very well, and like it was really hard to like get out of that, like just piece by piece and deconstruct. And I mean, even though I grew up around liberal cities like New York and Seattle, and I was still holding on in the back of my head, like my first vote at 18 went to Bush because I was just like, that's, Republicans, that's all I know. And my parents were listening to Rush Limbaugh and watching Fox News, and I grew up surrounded by that. So I was just like, yeah, and I emboldened by that, after the Moonies. So I guess in another way, maybe I cult hopped a little there, but yeah. But I just, enough people talked to me and were like patient with me, or, or even watching documentaries, actually, that was kind of helpful. First, I watched a few kooky, more kind of out there documentaries, but even those ones had like little bits of like, well, think about this or that. Like there's Zeitgeist movie. I don't know if you know about that one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, which has like really interesting observations about religion and power that I've never heard before, and I could feel myself be like, but no, but all my entire pride, like, and creed, like, depends on this story, and you're taking it away from me, So like, I know what that's like, and I'm like, I see other people holding on to that, but I think with me, I could rest a little easier about it, because like, I wasn't in a demographic where everyone thought that way, and everyone was a patriot and fighting and Jesus and, fighting for the country. But like, so I felt like there was more ground to land on after that. But I do feel bad for people who don't, who don't know anything beyond that, or maybe if they even feel a different way, being in a cult, like you can't choose, you'll lose your family and community and everyone if you challenge something, or there's that fear, at least, it's like it's to a lesser degree than LGBTQ people. You're coming out as like, oh, I think for myself now, and that's scary on a different level, but it's depending on how extreme your demographic is, it can be very scary. Yeah.
Very true. I know the clients that I work with recovering from religious trauma, if they've grown up in a family or community that's high demand religion or cult, to consider that might not be true and that they might want to break away from that. They look at losing their identity, their community, and their entire worldview. The only way they've ever seen the world, and the world has made sense to them, is about to dissolve or come crashing to the ground. Those are tremendous losses for people to have to work through. And I think it's really important. I love the way you are approaching it from a respectful and compassionate point of view. I never would refer to people who are currently involved in a cult or high demand group, I would never call them stupid, because that is completely unfair and often inaccurate. What they are is indoctrinated. And anybody
Mm.
can be indoctrinated. It just has to happen at a time when we're vulnerable. So for you and I, we're a second generation. Our parents indoctrinated us. But even maybe people or college students, like you mentioned, cults love to hang out in college and university towns because young people are away from home, often for the first time. So you don't have your solid footing. You're vulnerable there. Or maybe it's an older person who's lost a job or lost a partner. They're having some kind of transition going on, and they feel like they need some extra support. And you think of churches and those groups as being very community oriented and supportive, but some of those groups aren't healthy.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. I get that a lot. People I often say like, oh, I really appreciate that you're compassionate about this, or like you're patient, or like, and they're probably thinking in their heads like, well, I mean, maybe you understand this, but maybe like the average person is like, wow, you talk to them about them as if they're still like really rational people and stuff. And like, that must be really hard. And I'm like, well, I think for the hard part for me, and I think part of the reason I do that is that, I mean, my parents are still far right, and they're still, I think, I don't know if they're still in QAnon, but they more or less have said they were
Oh dear.
over the years. Yeah, it was hard. I remember my mom on a phone call about 2 years when, like, still briefly after Biden was elected, but she's still in the afterglow of Trump. Like we were on a phone call. I call them maybe once every month or a few months because of that. It's really hard. But yeah, she was talking about how the Democrats are, molesting children, and and she just like it just came just rolling into the conversation out of nowhere, and I was like, "F, fuck my life." I don't have any curse, but it is a religious trauma.
So what did you say? Like, what do you do in that instance where your parent, whom you love and would prefer to remain some kind of attachment to, but they are spewing the nonsense that they have been indoctrinated with inside that group? Do you just try and change the topic, or do you challenge them on it? What do you do?
Usually the first time, like that first time, it caught me off guard, and I just
Mm.
like tried to show them that I knew what was up. And I mean, you're never supposed to be confrontational, but I was like, because you're following Q, right? Q, da, da, da. And I just started to try to talk about the things I knew about QAnon and the followers and the games they play online to like get more indoctrinated. And she just like, it just made things worse, and she hung up on me. And
Oh,
but then I think we both thought in our heads like, well, shouldn't do that next time. So
okay.
yeah, I mean, I see my parents, like my mom's in a wheelchair. She got in that accident
All right.
like 1991, and so she's pretty helpless, but she's also a very determined person. And like I've told them before, I'm like, you hear the term cult survivors, and I'm like, I I feel like mom and dad, you're cult survivors. They don't like that word cult, and I don't say it around them like as much anymore. But like, I think, yeah, like they survived some really hard circumstances. Financially, they didn't have a resume, and they left in their late 40s. And like, my dad just painted murals. My mom did stay home jobs from a wheelchair. Like, it's crazy. So like, it's just like, I felt bad for them, and that they were victims too.
Mhm.
But I think I would be able to approach them as such and feel more like of an open compassion if they weren't my parents, who also were like this bridge of trauma. And there's all these feelings of and the abandonment and like I know why it happened, but the emotion and the processing I have to do to like get through that is hard. And it
Mhm.
changes from one day to another how I feel, because cults allow parents to just not be parents. Margaret Singer said, parents are middle managers in a cult. And so it just again, the indignity of not being prioritized in your family after learning that child-centered families is the healthiest way to go about it. Later in life, it's like I can't, like, sometimes I just want to burst open and cry and break everything in the room, but I'm like, well, I I don't know. That's not going to help. I don't think.
Hmm.
So I just try to talk about it and deal with it where I can. I see a good therapist, and I do
Good.
carve out time for processing things when I find, or when she brings up something she notices that maybe I haven't processed as much. Like, I'll be like, okay, tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, process o'clock. Yeah.
Good for
And
you.
it works.
That's
Yeah.
wise. Yeah, it's really complicated and sticky with our parents and with our family members, particularly if they are still involved in the group, or in your case, your parents left the original group, but they still have been swept up into a very right wing um, group. And a lot of the clients that come to me do come to me with the issue of they feel like their parents were normal, and then after Trump got in 2016 and QAnon arose, and it was kind of simultaneous, almost this cult of Trump, cult of QAnon swept through the churches as well. And so a lot of my clients then find not only have they kind of lost their identity and their worldview and their community, but they have either lost their parents or they're terrified about that loss. But then if they maintain that bond and my clients go on to have children, then they worry about, how can I keep my parents from indoctrinating or brainwashing my children? It's just a whole big thing, and it's not easy to work through. And for some people, their answer is to cut the family off and just move on without the family. But for a lot of people, it's not that simple. It's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts, and just trying to maintain a loving attitude and loving contact towards people whose brains really have been hijacked. It's not an easy task.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I really feel for I have three siblings who have kids, and yeah, they feel it the most, the lack of parenting. They're like, this was like, I think that's actually maybe one reason I didn't want to have kids. I'm like, I don't want this rage to come out of me. Like, what happened? I don't know. I mean, I think if I was in a situation where, as a parent, it wouldn't be totally overshadowed by that. I think I'd be happy and whatever. But I mean, ultimately, I chose not to have kids. But, like, yeah, I just it is hard. And I go to sometimes these, like, talks by cult experts where they talk about that, and how it could work like that, or it could work in reverse. If, like, a parent is in a cult and they want they're trying to indoctrinate their kids, and if let's say a relative gets in there, or like a grandparent, and just shows in, like, the simplest way that I don't know if I believe that stuff. In a way, when the child is young, like that, kind of the beliefs lose their power over them, or it shows that an adult you know doesn't take it as seriously. Like, that plants a seed of
Hmm.
questioning the kid, and, like, self-empowerment. So
Yeah.
little tip there. But yeah. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's hard.
I've worked with my clients, sometimes if they're concerned about that familial influence from the grandparents or aunts and uncles or whatever, I do encourage my clients to take out books from the library that kind of explore creation myths from around the world. And you're talking with the small children and saying, "Do you love stories? Everyone loves stories, and Grandma and Grandpa's favorite story is this one." But it's just a story. There are many stories that people tell around the world. And then, of course, the idea of a lot of people who leave high demand groups have concerns that if they're no longer in that group, where is the morality going to come from? As if that group or that religion has the market cornered on morality. So then I encourage people to delve into values clarification so they can kind of take a look at what their own values are. Previously, I really valued, say, obedience and submission, and now they don't even make it on my list because autonomy is my number one value, and curiosity. So people becoming familiar with their own values, and then exploring maybe humanism and what are the values of humanism, and taking children's books out of the library or ordering them online that explore facets of humanism with children, or just other ways that we can be talking about the rights that children have as individuals and human rights, and just having those discussions without any religion even being part of it. Because you mentioned a tip, I think those are some tips that also could be helpful for people.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. And yeah, when you said humanist, that was one of the buzzwords actually in the cults in the Moonies. Like they were like, oh, we don't want to be weak like these humanist people who just, they talked about mind body unity, and they're like, mind must subjugate the body, which is just, super. I'm going to a therapist for that. I feel kind of out of touch with my body. Like I'm going to this birthday at a spa soon, and I'm like, oh no. Because I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to feel good at all or feel anything. I'm going to try, but I get like full body massages, and I mean, I get into that. That's a little more aggressive, but like, at a spa where you get to choose which bath you want to take, or room, or sauna, I'm just like, I'm a little hesitant because I'm like, am I just going to be complete? Is it going to just remind me how detached I am from my body? Like, hopefully not. But yeah, no, the human thing was like a buzzword. And so in case you're talking to any Unification Church person, like, careful not to use that word too soon. It's like, I don't know. Yeah, because that was like overtly what Sun Myung Moon, he's like, humanists believe that, you're supposed to be lazy. Basically what you hear about far right people who are just also like, the body doesn't matter. And I don't know.
Wow.
All that matters is following, and, don't be lazy. It's like considered lazy, and yeah, like morality has to come from a brand of religion, so.
Right. Yeah, I think the leaders of the high demand groups really fear people pursuing their own autonomy, and humanism is about autonomy and dignity for everybody. And so I think that would be really threatening. I know growing up in the Christian church, certainly I heard lots of railing against secular humanists. And you wouldn't want to be a secular humanist, kind of spit it out like an insult. And then, fast forward to where I am now, I'm the president of my local Atheist Skeptics and Humanists Association, which I think is pretty fun. My siblings know that. I haven't quite got around to discussing that with my mom, who lives in the same town, and still finds comfort in some of her religious beliefs, but she's much more liberal than, say, my father, who was really fundamentalist. So it's much easier to maintain a relationship with her. And we can tell if we're getting onto sensitive ground with each other, and we can just choose to change the subject. If she really wants to go there, I'll check in with her if she really wants to go there. But if not, there are other things that we can discuss and spend time together. I wish everybody had that option. I know it's not open for everybody. Yeah. I wonder for you, how did your parents get into it? Like, you guys moved to Seattle. Was that where your grandfather was from?
Yeah, that's where my dad grew up. He was raised by his mom sometimes. Actually, this answered a lot of questions when I asked him about it in adulthood, like maybe in my early 30s. I just asked him like, about his childhood, and he said his mom put him up for adoption maybe when he was like maybe still a toddler, or after his dad died when he was like 3. So his whole formative years until maybe he was, I think, 9, he said he was passed around to different adoption places. And I was like, oh, you mean like your extended family would take care of you? And he was like, no, my parents would just like look in the classifieds for who was taking in children. And I
Oh
was
my
like, that
goodness.
answers so many questions about why, this cult was so appealing to you. It was like the first stability that he ever had, and
Wow.
community, just like love bombed, and so in that sense, I can understand. And in a way that it kind of helped me, it answers a lot of questions, and it helped me understand how we got here. And that kind of soothes my frustration, a little more, just knowing the backstory. So I encourage anyone who, if they are just not getting along with their parents in a cult, maybe if there's some way you can sneak in a conversation about their childhood and trying to understand where they're coming from, if you have the space for that, like, that was really helpful for me. But it doesn't forgive, the issues, obviously, but it does explain, and it does kind of give me a counterpoint to, like, I mean, if I had no explanation whatsoever, I probably wouldn't even be talking to him, so
It
yeah.
adds perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and that can actually be a really helpful step along our healing journey, is to learn about our parents' childhood and kind of what drew them towards the group that they were in. Teddy, how can people contact you?
Most of my like cult activism stuff, I guess, is on TikTok. I'm at 2D hose, like it's like 3D, 2D, 2D as in flat screen, and hose, just like fire hose on my last name. Someone took at Teddy Hose. I was like, what? There's no
What?
other Teddy Hose in the world. And all my other handles on everything else is at Teddy Hose. I think, yeah, except Facebook is at Teddy Hose Works. But yeah, on Instagram, or I guess X now they call it, or Blue Sky. Yeah, but mostly on TikTok is where I talk about the cult stuff and things in my life or whatever. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm sure glad that you do. I'm really grateful that you do, and I'm grateful that you did agree to be interviewed and speak on some of those, some of the Netflix shows and the A&E show, Cults and Extreme Belief. I feel like I've learned a lot just from spending time with you today. So thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity always, and that this conversation's on the table, especially such a, such an extreme year, this election year. Like, oh my God, especially the last week with the Supreme Court. I mean, oof. Again, that's actually, I don't think I even mentioned this in the interview yet, but the reason I came out so overtly instead of just like an article here, maybe a long-term project there about my cult upbringing, was because Trump was running for president, and because I saw the rise of the far right. That's what triggered me to be like, okay, like right away, a friend of mine who wrote for the Huffington Post before, she gave me some tips on how to get in there, and I contributed an article about that, called Trump's America Through the Eyes of a Cult Survivor. And I in 2017, I didn't think it would get this crazy, but I was like, this guy, it feels like my cult leader. And I was like literal cult leader. So anyway,
Wow.
yeah, so just, get out there and vote. And it's scary times. It feels like we're about to enter our dark ages. So let's stay vigilant, and and keep this conversation on the table.
Excellent. Yes, we've got too much at stake to give up. Now's the time that we really have to show up and stand up. So thanks again, Teddy Hose, for joining me on the Divorcing Religion podcast. And I wish you a happy birthday. You mentioned you have a birthday coming up, and I love the idea that you're going to the spa. Please give yourself permission just to be curious. I hope it turns out great for you.
Oh, it's not my birthday, but I'll tell them.
I love it. Excellent. Oh,
Thanks.
okay. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and I hope to see you again real soon. Take care. Thanks again, Teddy.
Thank you.